This is CyberSound, your simplified and fundamentals-focused source for all things cybersecurity.
Welcome to CyberSound. I'm your host, Jason Pufahl, joined in our main studio by Michael Grande, and joining in, what do we call it, CyberSound South, by Steve Maresca and Matt Fusaro. Thanks, everybody, for joining. And we're actually going to spend some time today looking ahead at 2025 and making some sort of security predictions. And what we've discovered, though, is it's not really practical to put four people into our main space. So we actually have both Steve and Matt, who are on this all the time, joining from 25 feet down the hall in our conference room. So thanks, guys, for doing that.
There, we could wave if the doors were open.
You could wave if the doors were open. So, but it looks pretty professional. So we've got the
It does. Yeah. Make an effort with that.
So Steve, so we ordered these actually intentionally. So Steve, you're up. You get the opportunity to make that the first look ahead.
I think we're starting in doom and gloom, and it's my job to talk about geopolitics and the effects that we can expect. We've lived in a luxurious world that's been stable, and now we're dealing with a multipolar world with some instability, I think is maybe the nicest way to put it. The U.S. government, at least, has issued several advisories in the last few months to expect sabotage attacks and things of that variety. And what I want to basically say is that the luxury that we had was solely to think about our risk relative to cybersecurity, cyber attacks, opportunistic theft, things like that. What we should expect in the future with our new reality here are hybrid attacks. Europe is experiencing this today more than we are, candidly, but the past election cycle certainly had some of what I'm referring to. And by that, I mean disruptive attacks that have nothing to do with technology, bomb threats, negative PR that's been manufactured, fake customers trying to obtain proprietary information just by engaging organizations through fraud. Intrusive surveillance. There's been a lot of reports of drones internationally invading airspace and things like that. Just spying in general and causing people to feel a little more paranoid. What's all of this mean? Ultimately, the landscape has shifted. We need to be thinking a bit more broadly. And what was historically something more defensible from a network perspective or a multi-factor identity protections sense, now it's more critical thought, vigilance across a lot of different areas, and trying to just anticipate where we might be vulnerable organizationally. That's it. Hopefully nothing really more heated will occur, but it's a different world going into 2025, and we need to recognize that.
So maybe just a follow up on it. Do you think this is more specific to like the defense industrial base or supply chain or, the power grid? Like, is there a specific sector that you think is most prone to these types of attacks?
I mean, realistically, I do think that the defense industrial base is a focus. But shipping providers, DHL, they've had flights that have gone down because of incendiary devices in Europe. It's so logistics in general, not necessarily pure defense and industrial base. I think your average municipality might be a target if you have, SCADA equipment and things like that open and accessible to the local network or not air-gapped. It's hard to answer. Bottom line is we should anticipate threat actors probing at multiple flanks because their goal is to distract and consume our time.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of companies that end up being collateral damage because of what they're targeting, or just used as a first step into those organizations. So these organizations might not be defense contractors themselves, but they might be providing a service they use or a vendor of that particular company that is the actual target, but could be a step to get in there, right? So
right. We've spent a lot of time talking over the last few years of the smash and grab attacks, the shortening time frames associated with ransomware. What we're talking about here is a shift towards more long dwell time, quiet, stealthy presence in networks from a cyber.
Higher level of effort.
Absolutely.
So maybe segueing a tiny bit, and you said you started with doom and gloom. I'll try to position mine then maybe on the positive side. Uh, I suggested that we're going to see an uptick in phishing and social engineering style attacks. And in the discussion preparing for this, I think, part of our takeaway was maybe that's a benefit, because instead of seeing some of these, technical drive-bys and exploitation of vulnerabilities and the move a little bit to social engineering, maybe that's an indicator that a lot of the technical controls that people are putting into place are working better, right? But we are seeing things that take a little bit more effort, in the social engineering space, actual sort of, real live voice calls and real live Teams calls, people using technologies to get in front of other people, but in a more, I guess I'll call it a more traditional way, short of sending an email or hoping to dupe somebody into clicking a link. We expect to see more of that because some of those technical controls are working better. And, they're really trying to develop and underscore that element of trust and sort of, using the human element now to exercise these threats. So
I think it's fair to say it's already begun in terms of that uptick. In the last 3 months alone, we've had tens of customers or non-customers experience those directed social engineering calls, bypassing all the technical controls and going to the people who can let them in through the front door, so to speak. So expect more of it.
Right. And it's, it's usually effective. I mean, that has been, the phishing, let's face it, right? I mean, social engineering has been a common element for almost every incident we've managed in some way, just a different form of that.
And we've talked a lot about the utilization of different tools and AI and sort of voice replication and things. Is that something still on the horizon?
Yeah, and I think it's probably what is driving some of the especially phishing attacks, right? A non-native English speaker now has the ability to create pretty convincing narratives that can be put through as a phishing attempt, right? Like you said, voice replication is definitely being used as well. And the asymmetry is definitely different than it was even a year ago. So while our technical controls are working, it's now attackers always go to what's the least resistance, right? And that's the people at this point.
And, and another echo of that is that the more sophisticated things that we described as less likely a year ago or a year and a half ago,
Right.
have been commoditized and now low cost to use by unsophisticated attackers. And that's why we see more of it.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, though, I think, right? The ability for some of these utilizing technology like, deep fake to create, audio and video, it's accessible now to non-technical people. So you don't have to be the sophisticated threat actor,
right,
to launch these attacks anymore.
On the other hand, though, we do need to emphasize increasing sophistication on the defensive side of the spectrum. A critical takeaway is validate the identity of the people that are claiming to ask for something. Zoom calls, show an ID, have them come by in person, whatever makes sense contextually is now a critical step. And that's not just help desks, that's finance and HR in terms of engaging, those offices. So lots of organizational need to do exactly that same sort of thing.
One of the other aspects that I look forward to 2025 is sort of this, I'm not going to use the proliferation word, but this increase in third-party risk assessments and security assessments of a lot of our different vendors. What do you feel like is driving that? And do you think that that's just going to continue? Almost feels like it's been pushed downhill, right? Large enterprises have been dealing with these things for a long time. We're seeing it now mid-market, small business. Where do you see that going?
Yeah, it is one of those few times where the trickle-down effect works, where what enterprise is doing has affected SMBs quite a bit in terms of the security questions that they're going to ask them before they purchase their products, right? And I think a lot of that has driven them to be a little bit more prepared so that they can make their sales to the enterprise. Insurance is driving that as well. There's been quite a few questionnaires that have grown considerably in size. You've seen a lot of that for sure firsthand. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is awareness and just being a little bit more cognizant about who you're doing business with So they want to ask more questions and have it on paper versus kind of a link and a handshake that it used to be.
Yeah. And I think there's a piece of the regulatory requirements now that the contractual language is getting flowed down to smaller organizations that might otherwise not have probably had the rigor to do those. And now they're being pushed to a little bit more. And I think I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah, the flow down requirements that are common for a lot of our customers are DFARS and ITAR and things in the defense realm, but also GLBA from the banking and finance world. So those are obligatory actions for those organizations to take, and all of their vendors, even if they're not as regulated, are seeing that echo. The overall maturity has increased across the board. So I think it's a net positive, even if it does require more work to fulfill.
Well, and I'm optimistic as more vendors are requested to fill these out, that we start to see a little bit more of a standardization, because that still has been a challenge, right? Where you're not able to simply request and get something in a common format. And I think we'll see an improvement there.
I hope so, because it's still a mess.
It's still a mess for sure.
As we sort of wind down 24 and look into 25, independent coin, Bitcoin value, cryptocurrency, right? Increased in value. Does that lead potentially to more security incidents, or is that just another mechanism, as far as a translation rate or a currency rate that the bad actors are going to use, to ultimately get to the same end?
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, there's a couple things there for my opinion. Threat actors are usually trying to move this stuff really quickly. So they're not going to hold on to a Bitcoin for 3 months, 4 months while something happens to it, right? It's going to get to a wallet, and then it's going to get changed to a fiat currency, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with market conditions there, which these may or may not be favorable. I actually have not seen the data. I'm sure there's something out there that kind of compares the rate of cyber incidents compared to what the actual crypto prices are. But kind of what we talked about, prior to this episode, it's, Bitcoin might be at, was it 99,000, 100,000 right now, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's particularly valuable in whatever currency the attacker is using, right? Because they still need a company to actually pay for something.
To still do it,
right.
yeah.
Most companies don't have a Bitcoin to give somebody.
Right. And they're only willing or able to pay so much. So whether it's 1 Bitcoin or a half a Bitcoin or 2 Bitcoins,
Still gets to the same dollar.
It does.
Yes.
No doubt, though, it is more lucrative today than it was 6 months or a year ago to make these currency exchanges. So just from that perspective, sure, there's potentially a higher benefit to transact. So if there is a reason to do it, perform an attack, then sure, that might be justification. But it is more complex than just the dollar figure associated with the crypto.
Yeah, I mean, I think an important takeaway, and it didn't really make our sheet exactly, but it's ransomware still continues to be an effective way to extort money. We see a lot of it, and businesses have to prepare around the fact that that's a potential impact this coming year, just like it was last year.
Yeah.
Though it's worthwhile stating that even if it's not a ransomware and encryption event, a mere business disruption still has the same extortion characteristic to it, and the payouts will be the same regardless of whether or not crypto is involved.
So, Matt, we were going to chat a little bit about cloud assets, I think.
Yeah. So 2025, I think, is probably going to continue the trend of misconfigurations being an issue. And when I say misconfigurations, so many companies, especially now in the SMB space, are moving either services or their infrastructure into the cloud. I think cloud adoption has kind of hit critical mass with our industries now. So what we're seeing a lot of is misconfiguration of things like MFA in order to protect a lot of those applications. We're seeing a lot of data repositories, whether they be things like ERPs, whether they be things like just plain old storage buckets out in the cloud, just not configured properly. So I think companies are going to have to start investing in ways to detect poor configurations or configuration drifts to actually detect the issues that cause that type of data leakage. And I think it's just going to become much more common for cloud assets to be compromised versus on-prem infrastructure.
And the configuration drift is a maintenance and sustainment exercise, but I want to emphasize, commissioning of new services is equally problematic in this regard. A deployment of a new ERP or a CRM for a company might involve test infrastructure that's accessible to the entire world, that contains real world organizational data. That's not being locked down like production is. And the same aspect of configuration applies here. Protect your data, whether it's being deployed in a lead into something that's a stable state or not. Afterward is as important as the beginning.
And I think it's important, and I mentioned this when we were planning for it. It's an age-old problem to deploy, test and development infrastructure, maybe not with the same security controls, and yet still, use some of your production data. Like, that's a really common thing. So the basic tenets of protecting your data, regardless of whether it's in production or test, sort of remains the same. I think, Steve, your argument is by using some of these cloud applications, it's more, full world accessible maybe than traditionally.
Right. Yeah. A loosely deployed test machine used to be behind a network perimeter. It's more defensible, even if it's not really deployed with thought behind it. Now it's, reachable through any internet browser without a perimeter in place. So that's fundamentally the problem.
So, as we look, we mentioned AI a couple of times, as it relates to sort of the SOC and what threat actors are using it for. Matt, what thoughts do you have on that looking into 2025?
And we should say the SOC, Security Operations Center, right? So
a lot of
the
abbreviations
group of
there.
folks that monitor, events coming out of security systems.
Although I would be supportive of a puppet show for CyberSound.
We could do that. We could do that another time.
I don't know if I got the stills for that, but we'll see. So for security operations centers, a lot of them have a lot of pressure to automate how they handle incidents, how they look at data, how they respond to things. AI is becoming a big part of that. The goal of a lot of operation centers at this point is to take the tier 1 out of the process a little bit, and how your tier 2 and tier 3 respond to real incidents that aren't noise. So what I see happening there is attempts by attackers to either confuse AI or poison the AI systems that might be running your SOC, or just avoid them completely and drive their tickets to be closed automatically. So it's kind of a obscurity thing that they can use to bypass controls, or just say hidden a little bit, where analysts may not have human eyes on some of the things that are happening because they're being automatically closed. So it might be a risk that we look at this year.
Like a really simple example of that is the fact that events might be escalated if they originate from a country not associated with the business, right? You can bypass that and stay below the threshold of escalation and alerting if the threat actor just comes through something domestic, through Indiana, Kansas, something that doesn't make impossible travel a facet that lead to an alert. Very easy to think about as a mechanism that deceives the algorithms that we're talking about.
Right. And there's a lot of, obviously there's a lot of value in automating a lot of that alert review, but then it does come with some associated work. So I think it's really important that there's human eyes looking at a lot of these events and not relying too heavily on the automation part of the AI part.
Yeah, you have to automate what's in a SOC, but you got to do it carefully.
So we said SOC again. So we're a Connecticut-based company, and University of Connecticut has I think the best puppetry program in the country.
I think that's true,
right? So we should maybe now you got me thinking about it. I feel like I should reach out to that.
Looking forward to 2025. I'm going to learn more about that. That's a factoid. I know.
There's a puppetry museum downtown Stores. It is a well-regarded puppetry program. Basketball.
Sock puppets
and puppetry. Yeah. I mean, there were some unbelievable puppets in that museum. So I think we have one last one, Steve, that you would put. You're trying to lighten the security, right? Security is a serious topic.
Exactly.
We're this doom and gloom, just talking puppets.
I guess, but I close out the 2025 look ahead by talking about auditing and auditors. The main message is organizations are already seeing and should expect increased scrutiny. And some of that has to do with some of the regulatory frameworks going into effect that weren't in the last several cycles. Some of that has to do with the SEC literally charging fraudulent activity and behavior of some of the big named auditors. They settled it out of court for multiple tens of millions of dollars. That's how serious some of these allegations were. But as an industry, auditors, whether they're in finance or otherwise, are kind of acting as though they're on notice. And what might have been a 10-question sheet sent over to a company last year is now 70 or 150. The tone of interaction is different, and the level of effort required to meet auditor demands is higher. That's all. I think it's a doubling down of the scrutiny to kind of course correct and overcorrect for the SEC's oversight. That doesn't mean it's time to panic. It just means make sure that you've produced evidence that supports your compliance objective. That's it. Keep doing what you're doing. Just make sure it's documented.
Yeah, and on that end, I think we're starting to see more companies, more and smaller companies have to do compliance activities that they probably didn't have to do, and it takes a certain amount of rigor. But I think it honestly does improve, especially now. Right, we're starting to see some real improvements here on security postures for some of the smaller companies. So
it's just another echo of the vendor third-party risk review and the overall maturity improvements that make social engineering more attractive. Across the board, everybody's getting better. Therefore, we have to hit some of the higher notes to ensure we're keeping the ship upright.
Yeah. And I feel like, one of the main themes that we've got here in these predictions is a little bit more of a focus on the person rather than the technology.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely an element of that where the technology is generally widely deployed for a variety of reasons, right? Insurance, compliance, et cetera. And people they remain pretty easy to trick in spite of, I think, an uptick in social
awareness.
Yeah. It's just general awareness. So
this to me feels like an inflection point, though. We've talked about that changing dynamic for multiple years now, especially as spurred by working from home and pandemic concerns and things like that, where multi-factor was not widely deployed. But now we've reached saturation. Yeah, we're at the point where what we were predicting is starting to shift, and I think it will make for a very interesting landscape going into 26.
Right, fair. Well, you've got our set of maybe that looks like 8 or 10 predictions. Maybe we'll review next year and see how we did. But I think this is a pretty safe list, quite frankly. I think so. If anybody has any questions, wants to talk about more of these, is concerned about anything, reach out. We're always happy to talk. But as always, we hope you got something valuable from today's episode. And thanks for listening.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to get in touch at Vancord on LinkedIn. And remember, stay vigilant, stay resilient. This has been CyberSound.